You referenced the polling, which I think is really interesting because prior to Gantz's resignation, there had been some reports suggesting he was popular enough to mount a real challenge in an election, a challenge against Netanyahu. Does that still hold? Could he still, in an election, become the next prime minister of Israel?
Yeah, I mean, anything's possible. But I think that one of the things that made him popular was that he was actually part of the government. And then as soon as he steps away from the government, he begins to lose support. And, it's amazing, but, we think about things here in the United States. We talk about our two parties, right? And it's complicated enough when a third party person comes in and begins to eat away at some of the votes that would normally go to the Republicans or the Democrats. In Israel, you've got like a dozen parties, and it is three-dimensional chess trying to figure out who's going to win. And if you decide if you're going to vote for one party because you like that party, or do you vote for another party because you think it's the one that will bring in the party that you like into a coalition, it is incredibly difficult to game all of this out. And so when we look at these polls, whether the past polls when Gantz was in government or the polls now where he's out, it's still a crapshoot. No one really has any clear idea how Israelis will vote until the day that they walk into that polling station and pull the trigger. The last thing I'll just say on the politics is there's actually a new party that's being formed right now in Israel, and it includes the former head of the Mossad, a guy by the name of Yossi Cohen, who is incredibly popular and charismatic and good looking. We have Naftali Bennett, the former prime minister of Israel, who served for a year in between Bibi's terms, and a number of other potentially very powerful figures that have been in the Israeli political arena for quite some time. They're going to start pulling in numbers, but no one has any idea whether they will pull enough. Again, once those polling stations open, people start making some interesting decisions. This is not anything remotely close to what we deal with in the US. It's far more complicated, and I never try to predict who's going to win anything in the Israeli elections. And a lot of the time, as we've seen in the past, they actually end up being a draw, right? Where the Israelis go to the polls and the numbers are inconclusive and they have to go do it again. It'll be interesting to see how this one starts to play out. But right now, there is nothing forcing the Israelis to go to elections. Right now, all of this is just sort of idle chatter until someone else decides to depart the coalition, and that's not happened yet.
In his resignation, Gantz did suggest or maybe push for an election in the fall. And we saw on Saturday night, after the news of the hostages, the 4 that had been rescued, there were protesters that filled the streets in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, some in support of a deal for further hostage release, but others calling for an election. Are these calls for elections a distraction from the broader conflict and the push for a ceasefire?
Well, it's interesting. In the 10 months leading up to the 10/7 attacks of last year, there were protests like these, massive protests out on the streets, people calling for Benjamin Netanyahu to resign, primarily because he was actually trying to reform the judiciary. He was trying to overhaul it in ways that felt anti-democratic to a large number of Israelis. I believe that in many ways, those protests actually yielded the 10/7 attacks. I'm convinced that the enemies of Israel were watching the unrest, and they were thinking that this was actually an ideal moment to attack. And so when we see these large protests coming out into the streets again, I do think it's a distraction. I do think that it gives the enemies of Israel a sense that perhaps there's another opportunity, that the Israeli people are divided, that they are split over their own leadership, let alone what the way forward would be for victory in Gaza or in any of the other fronts that have opened that Israel is fighting on. And there are, by the way, 6 or 7 of those by my count right now. And so, yes, I think that it could be a distraction. It could undermine the stability of the government. But I think we need to acknowledge something here, that Israel is a democracy, a vibrant one. And the people obviously have a right to go out and protest, whether there's a war or there isn't a war. And if they have strong opinions about their leadership, they have every right to express it. We just need to keep a close eye on the way in which these things are interpreted by some very vicious enemies of Israel.